3 days after the flood, the president of our community board stood in front of me and calmly explained that the destruction of my workshop was basically an act of nature. According to him, thousands of dollars in ruined tools, warped lumber, fried equipment, and a building full of muddy water somehow wasn't anybody's fault. The funny thing is, the flood didn't come from nature. It came from them. And what happened afterward turned a pristine private golf course into something that looked more like a Louisiana swamp than a luxury neighborhood amenity. My name is Ethan Mercer, and a couple years ago, I moved out to a quiet property on the edge of a town called Fairbrook, North Carolina. It wasn't some giant ranch or anything fancy. Just over 5 acres, a modest house, a detached workshop, and enough space that I didn't have to listen to my neighbors argue about lawn decorations every weekend. The property backed up against a private golf course owned by the Hawthorne Estates Community Association. Most people around town just call them Hawthorne. If you've ever lived near an HOA, you probably already know the type. They liked rules, they liked committees, and they especially liked reminding everyone how important their rules and committees were. Still, for the most part, they left me alone, and I left them alone. The workshop was my favorite part of the property. I built furniture there, restored old tools, worked on side projects, and honestly spent more time in that building than I did sitting on my couch. Over the years, I had collected equipment that wasn't cheap. A cabinet saw I saved for months to buy, specialty drills, sanders, compressors, shelves packed with hardware. Some people collect cars. I collected tools. Every single one had a story attached to it. That's why the morning of the flood hit me so hard. It started small. One afternoon, I noticed moisture running down one wall. At first, I figured it was humidity. North Carolina summers can be brutal. The next day, I saw a little puddle near one corner of the building. I climbed up and checked the roof, but couldn't find anything wrong. Then the following morning, I walked out carrying a cup of coffee, unlocked the workshop door, and immediately knew something was very wrong. Water burst out across my boots the second the door opened. I just stood there frozen. For a second, my brain couldn't even process what I was looking at. The entire floor was underwater. Storage bins floated against workbenches. Lumber drifted around like tiny rafts. Extension cords hung half-submerged. The smell hit next, wet wood, mud, oil, and something electrical burning deep inside equipment that had no business being underwater. I dropped my coffee without even realizing it. My table saw motor was gone. Battery chargers were ruined. Toolboxes sat in brown, muddy water. Boxes of screws and fasteners already showed orange rust forming around the edges. Years of work and thousands of dollars were sitting there drowned. I spent most of that day dragging things outside, trying to save whatever I could, but by evening it was obvious the damage was enormous. What kept bothering me wasn't just the flood itself. It hadn't rained. Not recently, anyway. We were actually having one of the driest stretches of the season. So where the hell did all this water come from? The next morning, I started walking the property. Behind the workshop, the ground sloped gently upward toward the golf course. That's when I found it. Fresh dirt. A long, narrow drainage ditch cut into the hillside. The soil was still loose enough to leave footprints. Water trickled through the trench in a steady stream. I followed it uphill for nearly half a mile. Every step made me angrier, because eventually the ditch connected directly into the golf course drainage system. Somebody had deliberately rerouted stormwater runoff away from the course and toward my land. I remember standing there staring at it and actually laughing, not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably blatant. They hadn't accidentally flooded me. They'd chosen me. My workshop happened to sit at the lowest point along that stretch of property, so when they redirected the water, gravity did the rest. They protected their golf course and sacrificed my land. Simple as that. I called Hawthorne's management office that afternoon. The property manager, a guy named Randall Pierce, answered after making me sit through 10 minutes of hold music. I explained exactly what happened. I explained the flooded workshop, the destroyed equipment, the drainage ditch, everything. When I finally finished talking, there was a long silence on the line. Then Randall said, "The drainage improvement project was approved several months ago." I thought maybe I heard him wrong. Approved? I asked. "Your project flooded my building." Another pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. Water migration is generally considered a natural occurrence. Natural occurrence. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear and stared at it. You dug a trench onto my property. Our engineers determined the project met all applicable requirements. My workshop is destroyed. I'm sorry you're experiencing difficulties, Mr. Mercer. That's when I realized I wasn't talking to a person. I was talking to an organization, a machine, one that had already decided it wasn't responsible no matter what evidence sat in front of it. By the time I hung up, I wasn't just angry anymore. I was curious, because people who act that confident usually think they have leverage. What I didn't know yet was that a few hundred yards away, hidden behind a row of trees near the edge of the golf course, sat a forgotten piece of property history that was about to become the biggest mistake Hawthorne Estates had ever made. A few days later, I was still cleaning mud out of the workshop when my neighbor Carl stopped by. Carl had lived in the area for almost 30 years and knew more local history than the county archives. He stood there looking at the damage, shaking his head the whole time. "This wasn't here before," he said, pointing toward the drainage ditch. "No kidding. Fia." He looked toward the golf course and gave me a strange expression. "You know, that course has always had water problems." That got my attention. We sat on overturned buckets, drinking coffee, while he told me stories about the land. Apparently, years before Hawthorne Estates became a luxury development, most of that property had been farmland. The golf course came later. According to Carl, the developers constantly battled drainage issues because the terrain naturally collected water in several low areas. They spent years installing ponds, pumps, and underground pipes trying to control it. That conversation planted a seed in my mind. If water management was so important to the golf course, maybe there was something I had overlooked. So the next weekend, I started walking the property lines. I wasn't looking for revenge yet. Honestly, I was looking for answers. The farther I explored, the more interesting things became. Near the back corner of my land sat a pond partially hidden behind a cluster of pines. I'd seen it hundreds of times before, but never paid much attention. It looked like part of the golf course. The water stayed unusually full year-round, and small irrigation pumps ran almost constantly during summer. What caught my eye that day was a metal overflow structure near the shoreline. The pipe disappeared underground before running towards several fairways. I followed the edge of the pond carefully. Then I noticed something strange. The property markers didn't line up with the shoreline the way I expected. One marker sat well inside what appeared to be golf course territory. At first I thought it was misplaced. Then I found another, and another. Suddenly I wasn't just curious anymore. Monday morning, I drove to the county records office. Most people think revenge starts with anger. In reality, it usually starts with paperwork. An older clerk helped me pull historical maps, surveys, easements, and parcel records. We spent nearly 2 hours digging through documents. The deeper we went, the more surprised she looked. Finally, she slid one survey across the desk and tapped a section with her finger. "Well," she said, "that's interesting." Interesting was an understatement. Roughly 60% of the irrigation pond sat inside my legal property boundary. Not only that, but the primary overflow control structure was entirely on my side of the line. I asked if there were any recorded agreements granting Hawthorne permanent rights to the pond. Easements, Usagecontract, shared maintenance agreements, anything. She searched again. Nothing. Apparently decades earlier. The previous owner of my property had verbally allowed the golf course to expand the pond slightly for irrigation purposes. A handshake agreement. No recorded documents. No legal protections. Nothing. I walked back to my truck and just sat there laughing. Not because I had discovered some secret fortune, because the same organization that spent thousands of dollars on lawyers and compliance reviews had built a critical piece of their irrigation system on land they didn't legally control. Suddenly, Randall's confidence on the phone made a lot more sense. They probably assumed nobody would ever check. Over the next several days, I dug deeper. I talked to former groundskeepers, maintenance workers, even a retired engineer who once consulted on the course. Piece by piece, the picture came together. The pond wasn't just decorative. It was the heart of the irrigation network. Water levels had to remain within a fairly specific range for the pumps and drainage systems to function efficiently. Too low and irrigation suffered. too high and runoff started backing into low sections of the course. The more I learned, the more a simple realization settled into my mind. Hawthorne had flooded my property because they believed I had no leverage. They saw one independent homeowner standing against an entire association. They assumed I would complain, maybe threaten a lawsuit, then eventually give up. The thing about arrogance is that it blinds people. They never imagined I might actually own part of the system they depended on. Around that time, my insurance adjuster completed his evaluation. The final damage estimate made my stomach turn. Between equipment, repairs, materials, electrical systems, and structural work, the losses were significant. When I forwarded the report to Hawthorne's board, they didn't even respond. Not one call, not one email, not one offer to inspect the damage. Silence. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Up until then, I had been focused on getting compensated. After that, I became focused on teaching a lesson. Now, before anyone gets the wrong idea, I didn't destroy property. I didn't sabotage equipment. I didn't trespass. Everything I did happened entirely on land I legally owned. That's an important distinction. One Friday afternoon, I rented some equipment, bought several lengths of pipe, and spent the weekend working near the pond. If somebody had driven past, they probably would have thought I was improving drainage around my property. In a way, I was. What I actually built was a simple overflow management system. Nothing complicated, nothing illegal. I modified the overflow area on my side of the pond and redirected excess water into a shallow channel leading back toward portions of the golf course that naturally sat at lower elevations. The key detail was this: I never blocked the pond completely. I never prevented water from moving. I simply controlled how much water remained inside a body of water that largely belonged to me. When I finished, the pond stayed noticeably fuller than before. Then I waited. The first week, nothing dramatic happened. A few damp patches appeared near one fairway. Maintenance crews drove around inspecting things. Nobody seemed overly concerned. During the second week, I noticed golf carts leaving deeper tire tracks. Certain low areas stayed wet longer than usual. A groundskeeper spent nearly an entire day operating pumps near one section. By week 3, things became much more noticeable. Fairways started developing standing water. One bunker looked like somebody had filled it with a garden hose. The rough near several greens became soft and muddy. Players complained. Maintenance crews worked overtime. Every morning, I drank coffee on my porch and watched utility vehicles driving back and forth in confusion. The beautiful thing about water is that it doesn't care about status. It doesn't care how expensive a neighborhood is. It doesn't care about board meetings, committees, lawyers, or management companies. Water follows gravity. That's it. Hawthorne had spent years manipulating natural drainage patterns to serve the golf course. The moment those patterns shifted against them, the entire system started fighting back. Then came the really expensive problems. Because the pond remained near maximum capacity, every irrigation cycle created new complications. Water removed from one area eventually returned through natural drainage channels. Pumps ran constantly. Fuel costs increased. Maintenance costs increased. Labor costs increased. Yet conditions kept worsening. A month earlier, they had dumped their excess water onto my property to protect the course. Now the course itself couldn't stay dry. Word spread quickly through the community. Homeowners started complaining at board meetings. Golf memberships were being suspended. Weekend tournaments were canceled. Social media groups filled with photos of flooded fairways and muddy cart paths. One image showed a golfer standing ankle-deep in water while attempting a putt. The comments were brutal. My favorite part was listening to rumors. Some people blamed weather. Others blamed faulty pumps. One resident claimed underground springs had suddenly appeared. Nobody suspected the quiet guy whose workshop they flooded. Then one Tuesday afternoon, I received a phone call. The number belonged to Hawthorne Estates. I answered immediately. The voice on the line wasn't Randall this time. It was board president Gregory Harlan. I met him once at a community function years earlier. He was the kind of man who always sounded like he was giving a presentation, even during casual conversations. "Mr. Mercer," he said, We'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss several ongoing water-related concerns. I almost laughed. Several ongoing water-related concerns. That's what they were calling it now. Not a crisis. Not a disaster. Concerns. Sure, I said. I'd be happy to discuss water concerns. There was a noticeable pause. Excellent. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting this week. I leaned back in my chair and looked out toward the pond. For the first time since my workshop flooded, I felt completely calm, because I knew something they were only beginning to understand. The balance of power had changed. They no longer controlled the conversation. And when we finally sat down face to face a few days later, the people who once dismissed my flooded workshop as a natural occurrence were about to discover exactly how expensive natural occurrences can become. The meeting happened inside Hawthorne Estates Clubhouse, and the moment I walked in, I could tell things had changed. A month earlier, they treated my flooded workshop like it wasn't their problem. Now half their golf course was waterlogged, tournaments were being canceled, and suddenly they wanted to talk. The board president, Gregory Harlan, sat across from me with Randall and two other board members. Gregory cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Mercer, we'd like to discuss some ongoing water issues affecting the course." I couldn't help smiling. Water issues? You mean natural occurrences? Nobody laughed. The room went completely silent. Gregory eventually leaned forward and admitted they believed modifications near the irrigation pond were contributing to the flooding. I nodded and asked, "The pond that's mostly on my property?" Another uncomfortable silence followed. That was the moment I knew they finally understood how much leverage they had lost. I slid a thick folder across the table containing repair estimates, insurance reports, photographs of my flooded workshop, and a complete inventory of everything their drainage project had destroyed. They spent several minutes reviewing the documents before Gregory finally looked up and sighed. "This is a substantial amount of damage." "Yes," I said, "it is." For the first time since this whole thing started, nobody tried to deny responsibility. There were no excuses, no legal buzzwords, and no talk about water naturally flowing downhill. Just reality. Over the next few weeks, negotiations moved surprisingly fast. Apparently, flooding a homeowner's workshop wasn't urgent, but flooding a private golf course got everyone's attention. The HOA agreed to remove the drainage ditch, install a proper underground stormwater system, restore my property, rebuild my workshop, and replace the equipment they had destroyed. In return, once everything was finished, I agreed to remove my overflow modifications and return the pond to normal operation. Construction crews arrived almost immediately. The ditch disappeared. New drainage pipes were installed. My workshop was rebuilt from the ground up. One by one, replacement tools arrived until the building looked better than it had before the flood. When everything was finally complete, I removed the overflow barrier. Within weeks, the golf course started drying out. The standing water disappeared, the fairways recovered, and tournaments resumed. Before long, everything looked normal again. Today, if you drive through Hawthorne Estates, you'd never know any of this happened. The grass is green, the ponds are calm, and golfers spend their weekends pretending the world is perfect. But every now and then, especially after a heavy rain, I'll walk down to that irrigation pond and look at the overflow pipe. It's still there, and it's still on my property. The funny thing is none of this would have happened if they'd simply taken responsibility from the beginning. Instead, they chose arrogance, and arrogance turned out to be far more expensive than honesty. So let me ask you this. If you were in my position, would you have gone straight to court, or would you have done exactly what I did and forced them to experience the consequences first? Let me know in the comments, because depending on who you ask, I'm either the guy who stood up to a powerful HOA or the guy who turned an entire golf course into a swamp just to make a point.